Welcome back. We are locked and loaded for another exciting episode of ATL Lawyers Supreme Court Docket Explained. I'm Nate, and welcome to the second episode of the series. Getting better at editing, so bear with me and be patient here. Hopefully you enjoyed the teaser for this episode. Getting better at it and learning as I go. So as that goes along, hopefully they'll get better and you'll be entertained and learning just as much. So welcome back again. If you're wondering why I'm always wearing a white shirt in these episodes, it's because there's a dark background and just looks better. You think you want a different color shirt? Let me know. We're going to put on a different shirt. Not a big deal. So with that, let's get started with our second case that's on the Supreme Court docket currently. The case of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. City of New York, the Big Apple. So, as indicated in the intro, this case involves the City of New York, which is in the Second Circuit, and this is on appeal to the Supreme Court from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals from an opinion that was handed down back in 2018. So, in New York City, you can possess a handgun in your place of residence so long as you have a premises license, and that license allows you to own and hold that pistol or handgun in your possession in your place of residence, and you're not allowed to transport it outside of the residence or outside the city unless an exception applies. So one of those exceptions is that you can take that firearm to a gun range or gun club and fire it. However, the restriction on that exception is that they must be inside the New York City limits. What the petitioners in this case are arguing is that they can't take their handguns outside the city limits to other gun clubs or in New Jersey or outside the city limits in New York without breaking the law. And one of the petitions argues that he wants to transport his firearm to his second home in upstate New York, but he can't do that because if he takes that gun and moves it outside of his place of residence to his home in upstate New York, then he's violating the New York City law prohibiting the movement of this firearm outside of your residence when you have this premises license. So that's what this lawsuit is based on. So the three petitioners in this case, they filed suit against the City of New York, and what they alleged was that the law violated their Second Amendment constitutional rights, it violated the Interstate Commerce Clause, and that it impeded their right to travel under the Constitution. So those are the three main areas in which they alleged that the law is invalid and should be struck down by the courts. And they filed their lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, and the city, of course, responded. The petitioners in this case moved for summary judgment, asking the court to rule for them and have an injunction from the law getting into effect, saying that their constitutional rights under the Second Amendment have been violated, as well as their right to interstate travel, and the Interstate Commerce Clause was violated. The city, in response, also moved for summary judgment for the court to rule for them, saying that, no, your rights are not being violated. This law does not restrict you in an unconstitutional manner. The district court for the Southern District of New York agreed with the city and said that, no, sorry, petitioners, but your rights are not being violated in this case, and ruled for summary judgment in favor of the city. So score one for the city. On appeal, the petitioners argued the same thing, that their Second Amendment rights were violated, that the Commerce Clause was violated, and that it violated their right to interstate travel. The Second Circuit affirmed the district court's ruling and said, we're sorry, petitioners, but none of those things have been violated by the New York law in this case, prohibiting you from transporting this firearm from outside the city limits from your home. Petitioners then filed an appeal from the Second Circuit up to the Supreme Court, where it's currently pending a decision by the Supreme Court, probably going to come out pretty soon. So the timeline in this case is very important because it goes to the question of mootness that is argued by the city, which we'll get to in the legal portion of the episode. So the timeline is as follows. The petitioners filed suit in the Southern District of New York in 2013. The district court issued their ruling in 2015. They then appealed up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, who issued their ruling affirming the district court's ruling in 2018. The petitioners then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court granted cert in January 2019. In July 2019, both the state of New York and the city of New York changed the laws with respect to the premises license. And they changed the laws so that people who have a premises license that possess a handgun can now transport their handgun to any place of business, another residence, to any gun club or range within the state and anywhere else that they have a license to possess that handgun at. So that timeline is important because one of the legal arguments propounded by the city is that the case is moot. Moot, like a cow, not mute, like a mime. So what is mootness? Mootness is when there is no longer an active controversy that would give the court jurisdiction, so they should dismiss it because there's no longer a conflict. So an example of that would be, I apply to law school and I'm denied admission. I think there's been some illegal discrimination in the application and acceptance process. I sue. In the meantime, I get accepted to law school. And so now I'm a student and I'm going to law school and I'm happy. The court may dismiss the case as moot because there's no longer an active controversy between me and the law school because I got in and I was admitted. So where's the conflict? Where's the controversy? So that's an example of mootness. And the city's raising that legal argument as one of their arguments as to why the Supreme Court should dismiss this case and uphold the Second Circuit's ruling. Other than the mootness issue, which we just talked about, the only other issue that's going to be considered by the Supreme Court in this case is, does the prior New York City law that banned the transportation of a licensed unloaded handgun to a home or shooting range outside the city violate an individual's Second Amendment rights to bear arms, the Commerce Clause, or an individual's constitutional right to travel? So now that we have the issue of law nailed down, let's hear the arguments and let each side shoot their shot. So putting on my petitioner's cap in this case, they argue that their Second Amendment constitutional rights are violated by the New York law as originally written. So they argue that the plain language of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is violated because by prohibiting the transport of your arms, you're violating their right to bear them. They argue that the term to bear arms in the Second Amendment would imply that you also have the right to transport those arms freely as part of your exercise of that constitutional right. They reason that if you reduce this and you can't travel with the arms that you're constitutionally entitled to carry, then this is essentially boils down to a homebound right, which they say is not the point of the law at all. The point of the law is to be able to have the firearm on your possession and be able to transport it. And in support of this, they say in the history of the law and the history of the United States, you were able to transport your firearm, to train with it, and maintain your skill in the use of that firearm. So that's their reasoning behind that this is a violation of the Second Amendment and their constitutional rights thereunder. The petitioners also argue that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals erred in its application of the scrutiny test, which it would apply to the New York law as originally written. Time out. Let's stop for a second and talk about what we mean by scrutiny and how it affects the courts. We'll scrutinize this issue for you. So, what are we talking about when we refer to scrutiny by the court with respect to each side's arguments and the application of a law? So there are three levels of scrutiny, and that's how courts determine whether a government is violating the Constitution. And you'll see there is rational basis review, intermediate scrutiny, and strict scrutiny. And those are an increased level of how a court will look at a law to see whether or not a government has violated someone's rights under the Constitution. So strict scrutiny is the highest level of review by a court, and that's usually applied in situations where the government has passed a law that could violate a fundamental protected liberty of an individual. So examples, your fundamental right to procreate, or your fundamental right to political speech, those sorts of things. So the courts are going to apply the highest level of scrutiny as to whether or not the government has a compelling interest to pass this law, or would that interest by the government unduly burden your right to exercise this fundamental right you have under the Constitution. There's rational basis review by the court, which is the lowest level of review, which says that government can regulate private conduct so long as that law is not discriminatory, arbitrary, and it is relevant to the action that is regulated. And then there's intermediate scrutiny review, which says that the law passed by a government has to be substantially related to an important government interest. Thus, with that in mind, they argue that the strict scrutiny standard should be applied because this is a fundamental right under the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And the petitioners argue that there is no compelling public safety interest by prohibiting the transport of a firearm, which they're entitled to do under the Second Amendment to the Constitution, outside the city limits of New York. So in response, the city of New York argues that you got to look at the history, the context, and the prior application of the Second Amendment and how it's enforced today. And they argue that, yes, you do have a right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. However, it's a right to bear those arms and use them for confrontation. And historically and currently, the courts and the laws state that cities and states and local jurisdictions have a right to regulate the possession of firearms within their political jurisdictions. So, example, states have a right to impose concealed weapon permit standards. So the argument about the city here is, hey, we're not burdening your right under the Second Amendment. We're just exercising our rights as a local municipality to impose regulations on your possession of that firearm, which the courts in the past have upheld to be constitutional under the Second Amendment. The city also argues from a historical context that militias, even in the antebellum times, were prescribed areas where they could train and where they could possess their firearms with respect to their participation in the militia. And usually when you were transporting those firearms to and from those spots that were assigned for training in those militias, you would transport those firearms unloaded as was required by the law here. So they say from a historical standpoint, this fits well within the meaning of the Second Amendment as it was originally intended by the Founding Fathers as drafted. The city also argues that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals was correct in applying the intermediate scrutiny standard because there is an important government interest with respect to public safety, and that even if you applied the strict scrutiny standard in this case, there is not a substantial burden to someone's right to possess and bear a firearm under the Second Amendment as the law was originally drafted. So they want the Supreme Court to affirm the Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision that the intermediate scrutiny test was the correct test to be used here, and that the law substantially relates to an important government purpose of public safety. So what is the Commerce Clause? Without getting too far in the weeds, we can discuss the Commerce Clause in detail, maybe in another episode. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce between each of the states. So this language in this section of the Constitution has been used as the basis for many Supreme Court decisions since the New Deal to uphold these laws passed by Congress on the grounds that these involve interstate commerce, and therefore it is within the power of Congress to pass these laws. So since the Constitution reserves the power to regulate interstate commerce to the federal government, states essentially cannot pass laws that would prohibit an individual's means of moving in between the states or conducting commerce in between the states. So an example of that would be Montana can't pass an exit tax prohibiting you from leaving Montana unless you pay this tax in order to go into Idaho. That would be viewed as a constraint, as impeding interstate commerce and as a power reserved for the federal government. And thus that law would be unconstitutional. Similarly, states cannot pass a law that would impede someone's right to travel freely in between the states and the union. So keep that in mind when we go over the analysis by and the arguments propounded by both sides in this case. The petitioner's second argument is that the city of New York is not permitted to regulate interstate commerce under the Commerce Clause. That's reserved for the federal government. So they say that passing this law violates that principle. So the petitioners are arguing that the Commerce Clause has been violated because the city is prohibiting firearms, which are constitutionally permitted articles of Congress, from being transported outside of the city under this city law. So in other words, they're arguing that by prohibiting the transport of these firearms outside the city, which could be into another state, you're potentially violating the Commerce Clause, because only Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, not the city of New York. Thus, it is an unconstitutional law. So the city argues that with respect to interstate commerce, that Congress created the right to transport a firearm across state lines under the Commerce Clause. And in doing so, they delegated certain duties to the states and local municipalities with respect to how those firearms were transported through the various states. So under the Commerce Clause, Congress said that, yes, you can transport these firearms. However, state and local jurisdictions do have some say in the laws regulating how they can be possessed and transported through those states and municipalities. So with that argument, the city says that the city law limiting the possession and transport of these firearms within the city limit does not violate the Commerce Clause with respect to only being able to transport these firearms within the city limits. They also argue that there is no favor with respect to in-state commerce in this case. So the city argues that the Commerce Clause is not violated because they are not favoring in-state versus out-of-state. Individuals are free to travel to ranges and clubs outside the city and outside of the state. However, they're just not permitted to take the firearm for which they have a premises license for in the city with them. So there is no policy with respect to this law that would favor in-state economic transactions versus out-of-state economic transactions, which would be prohibited under the Commerce Clause jurisprudence. Finally, the petitioners argue that it's an impediment to their right to travel under the Constitution. So states cannot pass laws and cities cannot pass laws that would deter someone from traveling between the states. So they argue that this law is deterring them from using out-of-state ranges and out-of-city ranges and violating their right to travel under the Constitution, because they would go visit these other ranges with their own firearms, but for this New York law that says if you're going to have this premises license, you cannot transport it outside the city limits. So the petitioners essentially say that if they violate this city law, their premises license can be revoked, thus their gun taken away and they're not allowed to possess it anymore, so that they have to choose between their right to travel outside of the city and outside of the state versus their right to possess and bear a firearm under the Second Amendment. And that clash is what they're arguing makes this law unconstitutional. The city argues in this case that there is no actual deterrent of someone's right to travel in and out of New York City and New York State, but rather it's just a prohibition on the transport of goods, and argues that if the court were to adopt the reasoning of the petitioners with respect to the right to travel argument, then that many of the existing laws that prohibit certain goods from being transported or regulate certain goods being transported in between the states, those laws would be invalidated in this case if they were to adopt the petitioners' argument that their rights to travel were violated. So how are the justices going to rule in this case? Given the makeup of the current Supreme Court, I think it's going to be a 5-4 decision, and I think they're going to overturn the Second Circuit and hold that the constitutional rights of the petitioners were violated in this case. I think if it is a 5-4 decision in favor of overturning the lower court of appeals, I think Justice Thomas may write this decision because he's always shown animosity towards the use of the Commerce Clause, and this will give him another platform to espouse his views on that matter. His main concern with that is essentially this clause gives the government unlimited police powers with respect to anything involving interstate commerce, and he always takes the opportunity to try and rein those powers in. And that is my final prediction. We aimed high in this episode to give you a little more fun and a little more quality, and hopefully we didn't shoot down your expectations in this episode, but hope you enjoyed it. Like, comment, share, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks.